In 2007, I think you were walking down a path to the Acropolis of Athens. And for a student of history, architecture, and design, this should have been a joyous experience for you. But by the end of it, you were pretty frustrated.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that story. What happened on that walk? What did you see? What did you feel? And what did that tell you about the philosophy of disability?
So as somebody who studied architecture in the United States, I've had one professor after the other, some quite famous, talk about their experience of walking to the top of the Acropolis in Athens, Greece, going from the bottom and winding up. It's about 300-foot climb. Maybe a bit more than that, but off the top of my head, that's what I remember. Maybe it's okay. And not only did they talk about how important this experience was for them in terms of being an architect, but they talked about how people in history had this experience going way back to 250 years of people going to the Acropolis when it was part of the Ottoman Empire and walking up to the top, Le Corbusier, Louis Kahn, on and on and on. Okay. So when I was fortunate enough to be able to afford a trip to Athens as a guest, the first thing I did after the plane landed was take a taxi to the foot of the Acropolis and do this climb because I'd heard so much about it. Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, I wear an artificial leg, and I don't necessarily walk like someone who's very has both their limbs and very physically capacitated. So I went up this very famous walk, and I was so angry at the end of the walk. First of all, it's extraordinarily arduous. Okay, so that made me annoyed. But the thing that made me the most angry that was that the walk that I walked on, and I knew this before, the walk that I walked on, the path, was built in the 1950s and early 1960s. Okay, and originally, 2,500 years ago, the Acropolis was reached by a series of enormous and gently sloping ramps. And almost nobody knows this. And so it annoyed me because these architects who wrote about the kind of torturous experience to get to the top and how difficult it was and that they made it and how great the experience was, it wasn't necessarily, let's say, an authentic experience of the building, right? It was one that was built into it over time and one that became more and more kind of celebrated in the 20th century and like literally built into the experience of it in the 1950s, in which this architect made a path which many architects think is like a wonderful, beautiful experience, and it is very, striking and pleasant to look at, but it's one that really demands a lot from your body. It gets increasingly steep as you get to the top, and it has more and more stairs as you get towards the top, and you eventually walk on this narrow single file path before you get to the entry to the Acropolis.
Yeah.
And all of that is designed. That is not part of the history of this place, okay? And it's one that works against the way that the site was reached so long ago, right? Yeah. And so when you go to the Acropolis and then you walk down, you go to the Acropolis Museum at the base of the Acropolis, they actually have a model of what the Acropolis looked like with these ramps. And when I looked at that, I thought, oh my God, like they're rebuilding everything at that site, which I may take issue with, to look like it did 2,500 years ago. Why don't they build the ramps if they're so obsessed with the particular experiences and ideas of what this looked like 2,500 years ago? But I think one of the reasons those things aren't built is because I think the arduousness of getting to the top has been written about by so many people that it's become seen as part of like the necessary experience of the place. Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think we put a premium on this art value or the age value where physical capacity is so tightly coupled with being an admirer of these historical places? Like you have to be able to walk these thousands of miles or climb 10,000 steps to get to those ruins. And if you don't do it that way, you're not experiencing it properly.
Yeah.
Why do you think this is so tightly coupled so it ends up alienating people who might not have that physical capacity?
Yeah, I mean, I read about this in my book, The Architecture of Disability, that you mentioned. I mean, I think it's an idea about how knowledge is created. There's this belief, I think, in its origins are in Europe, but it's certainly traveled to the United States and Canada, that like physical exertion somehow is like a pathway to knowledge of the world, right? And that and it's particularly tied up with knowledge of like deep history, so that like ruins and archaeology have to be experienced under physical duress. If this sounds like super intellectual, look at Indiana Jones and those movies. It's a great example of how this idea gets like pushed into popular culture, that the discovery of the past, the discovery of history is one that that's the most extreme example, right? But it's one that probably everybody knows, but one that involves like, taking one's body to like a physical extreme, right? It's absurd, but it's part of a belief system that's kind of in the woodwork of a kind of European understanding of history and archaeology.
Yeah, how did that come about?
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't gotten into the origins of it, but it's a great question. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. Like I think it's part of the history of like the Romantic movement in the early 19th century, in which the feelings of like physical duress suddenly become written about in poetry and produced in artworks that show figures and people, or in poetry and writing in which people talk about their difficult experiences of the world somehow being more like true and authentic experiences of the world. Yeah.
Very interesting the way it was romanticized, like these physical capacity, and that walks hand in hand with being able to appreciate these areas of historical significance. Very interesting. I think you saw something similar at the Basilica of Saint Denis. You'll have to pardon my French.
Yeah, no, sounds great.
Yeah, sounds great. Where exactly what you mentioned, where disabilities, if you look at the historical context behind the Acropolis, they had these ramps built around, but now disability is viewed as this technical problem that needs to be solved.
Yeah.
And what you're asking for in your work and your research is we need to revisit the dialogue that we are having and look at ways in which we can integrate part of the design.
Yeah, thank you so much for mentioning that. So that's a very important part of this whole story. So when I went to the Acropolis, and somebody could experience today, there's an elevator that you can take to the top if you're a disabled person. Yeah. And so when I went there, it's been rebuilt, but when I went there, it was very rickety. And I thought, there's no way I'm going up that. Like frightening. It was like a modified construction elevator. You know, it looked very, it didn't look safe to me. Yeah. And they've since rebuilt it. What was I going to say? Yeah. So the larger point is that today, when these sites address disability or visitors that have impairments of various sorts, they make these kinds of accessibility adjustments. And so the message to disabled people is like, now you are welcomed into these historic sites. But when you look at history, the Acropolis, the Basilica at Saint Denis that you mentioned, these are all places that disabled people went to, at the Acropolis 2,500 years ago, Basilica Saint Denis, disabled people have been visiting that church since its construction, both because they're just disabled worshipers, or also because the belief within Catholic belief that touching relics or praying for people that are, ill or need, medical help, the idea that one goes to a church to address one's ailments, right, is something that, I'm sure many people can relate to. So the idea that we have to make these technical fixes to relate disabled people to them, I think is a bit wrong-headed. I think we should understand the way disabled people have helped create the culture around these places in the first place. And we should invite people like myself or other disabled people to think about what these buildings might become beyond just installing a ramp or, like a contemporary ramp to get up a stair, or installing an elevator to help somebody get into it. We made these places historically, right? Yeah. And that's important for people to understand.